I almost canceled that night. Not because I didn't want to go, but because something about it felt off in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, it was quieter than that. Like a small voice in the back of my mind asking, why this one? I ignored it. And somehow that decision ended up teaching me more about people and myself than anything I had learned in years. I had been on plenty of dates before. By that point in my life, dating felt more like a routine than an experience. Same conversations, same questions, same predictable patterns. I could almost guess how a date would go within the first 10 minutes. I worked a steady corporate job, kept a consistent schedule, and tried to make time for putting myself out there, as my friends like to say. It felt like something I should be doing, even if I wasn't entirely sure why anymore. Most of the people I met were fine, nothing wrong with them, but nothing that stayed with me either. Conversations that sounded meaningful in the moment, but faded by the time I got home. I think deep down, I had developed a quiet belief. People were mostly surface level, predictable. You just had to listen long enough to hear the patterns. And honestly, I thought I was good at that. Then, I met her. Her name was Lisa. We matched on an app, and the conversation was normal. No sparks, no deep connection, no clever banter, just simple, polite exchanges. If anything, I remember thinking, this will probably be another average night. But she suggested a small cafe instead of a typical restaurant, somewhere quieter. That stood out just enough for me to say yes. Still, on the day of the date, I hesitated. I remember standing in my apartment, holding my keys, thinking I could just reschedule. But I didn't. The cafe was smaller than I expected. Dim lighting, soft music, the kind of place where people actually talked instead of scrolling through their phones. It felt slower. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, no phone in her hand, just looking outside like she was watching something I couldn't see. When I walked up, she smiled politely. Not overly enthusiastic, not distant either, just present. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people, myself included, carried a kind of background urgency, like we were always partially somewhere else. But she didn't seem rushed at all. We started talking. Basic things at first, work, where we grew up, the usual. But something felt slightly different. Not in what she said, but in how she listened. When I spoke, she didn't interrupt, didn't nod excessively, didn't try to jump ahead or relate everything back to herself. She just listened. And oddly enough, that made me a little uncomfortable. I remember thinking, why isn't she reacting more? It wasn't that she was cold, she just wasn't performing the usual social rhythm I was used to. At one point, I made a joke. Normally, that's a safe moment. People laugh or at least smile. But she paused for a second, then said, "That sounded more like something you say when you're trying to avoid something." It caught me off guard. I laughed it off, but internally I was thinking, what does that even mean? No one had ever responded to me like that on a date. Not wrong, just unexpected. As the conversation continued, I started noticing small things. She asked fewer questions than most people, but the ones she did ask felt precise. Not invasive, just oddly specific. At one point, she asked, "Do you actually enjoy your job, or do you just like being good at it?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out right away. It was such a simple question, but I realized I didn't have a simple answer. So I defaulted to something safe. I mean, it's stable. I've worked hard to get where I am. She nodded, but didn't say anything else. No follow-up, no validation, just silence. And for some reason, that silence felt louder than any response. I remember thinking, is she judging me? That thought lingered longer than I expected. About halfway through the date, something shifted. Not in the environment, not in her behavior, in me. I realized I was becoming more aware of what I was saying, almost like I was hearing myself from the outside. The way I framed things, the way I avoided certain details, the way I subtly tried to sound more put together than it actually felt. It wasn't that she was calling me out directly. She just wasn't reinforcing the version of myself I usually presented. And without that reinforcement, it started to feel fragile. I remember thinking, why does this feel different from every other date? Then came the moment I didn't expect. She asked, "What's something you've been wrong about recently?" It was such a strange question for a first date. I laughed lightly, trying to buy time. "That's a deep one." She shrugged slightly. "Not really. Everyone's wrong about something. Most people just don't like admitting it." I felt a subtle tension in my chest. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many. And none of them felt comfortable to say out loud. So again, I gave a safe answer. Something small, harmless. She listened, nodded, and then said, "That sounds like the kind of answer people give when they don't want to think too hard." There wasn't an accusation in her voice. That's what made it harder to react to. If she had sounded critical, I could have defended myself. But she didn't. She just stated it. And suddenly I didn't feel like I was on a date anymore. I felt like I was being quietly observed. That's when I made a decision. I could either keep playing it safe, or I could actually engage with what was happening. I don't know why, but I chose the second option. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was slightly irritated. Or maybe part of me wanted to see what would happen if I stopped controlling the conversation. So I paused, took a breath, and said, "Okay, if I'm being honest, I think I've been wrong about people." She didn't react immediately, just waited. That gave me enough space to continue. I think I've always thought I was good at reading people, figuring them out quickly. But lately, I'm starting to think I've just been seeing what I expect to see. Saying that out loud felt uncomfortable, but also strangely relieving. For the first time that night, I wasn't trying to sound impressive or composed. I was just saying something real. She nodded slowly, and then said something that stayed with me long after the day ended. "Most people don't actually see others," she said. "They see their own assumptions reflected back." We didn't talk much after that. Not in the same way. The conversation became quieter, less structured, more honest. Not in a dramatic way, just small, real exchanges without the usual layers of performance. When the check came, we split it without discussion. We walked outside together. It was a calm night. No rush, no awkward goodbye, just a simple, "It was nice meeting you." And that was it. No follow-up plans, no, "We should do this again." Just closure. On the drive home, I kept replaying the evening in my head. Not the big moments, the small ones. The pauses, the questions, the way she listened. And more importantly, the way I reacted. I realized something I hadn't noticed before. On most dates, I wasn't really trying to understand the other person. I was trying to be understood, trying to present a version of myself that would be accepted, liked, approved. And I assumed everyone else was doing the same. So the conversations never went deeper than that. Not because people were shallow, but because we were all performing. That night felt different because she didn't participate in that performance. She didn't push, didn't judge, didn't try to impress. She just stayed present. and that presence made everything else visible. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking differently. At work, with friends, even in small interactions. I started noticing how quickly I formed opinions about people, how often I assumed I knew what someone meant before they finished speaking, how I filled in gaps with my own interpretations instead of asking questions. It wasn't intentional. It was automatic. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That one date didn't change my life overnight, but it changed something quieter. It shifted the way I paid attention. I stopped trying to categorize people so quickly, stopped assuming I knew their motivations after a few conversations, and more importantly, I started questioning my own interpretations. Not in a paranoid way, just with a little more awareness. The biggest lesson wasn't about dating. It was about perception. I had spent years thinking experience made me better at understanding people. But in reality, it had just made my assumptions more efficient. Faster judgments, quicker conclusions, less curiosity. And that night reminded me of something simple. Understanding people isn't about how quickly you can figure them out. It's about how willing you are to realize you might be wrong. I never saw Lisa again. No messages, no second date. And strangely, that felt appropriate. Because it didn't feel like an unfinished story, it felt like a complete moment. One that didn't need anything more. Sometimes I still think about that question she asked. What's something you've been wrong about recently? Not because I have a perfect answer now, but because I ask myself that more often. And every time I do, I notice something new. Something small. Something I would have missed before. And I guess that's the part that stayed with me the most. Not the conversation, not the person, but the awareness. The realization that most of what we see in others is filtered through what we already believe. So now, when I meet someone new, I try to pause just a little longer, listen a little more carefully, and question what I think I understand. Because maybe the most important things about people are the ones we don't notice right away. And maybe the real question isn't whether we understand others, but how often we're willing to admit that we don't.